Hello, everyone. I'm Melissa Pache, CEO of the Whistler Chamber of Commerce. Today is February 9th, 2021. I would like to acknowledge that we are having this virtual update on the shared unceded traditional territories of the Squamish-Lillooet Nations, and we honor their language, culture, land, and traditions. I would like to start by thanking all of our members for your continued support the Chamber receives through our annual memberships and commitments enabling us to do the important work that we do. For this virtual update, we are joined by Chris Bach, OHS Consultation and Education Services at WorkSafeBC, and Arun Subramanian, Director, Industry, Health and Safety at go2HR. Arun, I really hope I did not mispronounce your name on that one. You can correct me. Yeah, so during these challenging times, so we will be talking about best practices for updating your COVID-19 safety plan and how to communicate this with your teams out in the Whistler community. So it's my pleasure now to introduce you to our guests, Chris Bach and Arun. So Chris, why don't we start with you? You're with WorkSafeBC, so this is a big conversation these days, started back a year ago. Can you imagine? It's already almost a year ago that we started having conversations. You did come and visit with us last year, and you're back again. So I guess the first question that I wanted to ask you was, what are the key changes to WorkSafe expectations that you could share with us?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you, Melissa, for having me here today. And I wanted to mention that I'm coming to you from the traditional territories of the Coast Salish, the Kwantlen, and the Tsawwassen peoples. So yeah, what are the key changes to WorkSafeBC's expectations? Really, our expectations haven't changed all that much. You know, we do expect employers are taking measures to reduce the risk of COVID transmission in the workplace. And really, the foundation for that is in the COVID safety plan. So we created a template for a COVID safety plan to assist employers back in, I'm going to say it was April, May of last year. And really those expectations haven't changed. If employers go through that 6-step process, actually really at this point, now that we have most businesses back up and running, it's really the first 5 steps of that process. Then really they are meeting the expectations of what WorkSafeBC is looking for. Right. We have lots of information on our website. We have a template on our website that can help employers be able to work through that. We've developed industry-specific protocols that will help employers. And we also are here to be able to answer any questions that employers might have. So employers can call our prevention information line at 1-888-621-7233 if there's any assistance that they need in keeping that plan up to date.
No, that's really good information to reshare again, and just to let our viewers know that on Friday last week we did send out that link to WorkSafeBC again, and also Arun will be talking about the safety plan that they have at go2HR later on in this conversation. So we'll keep reiterating that and still sharing the tools for everyone. So this is a question actually for both of you. What are the areas of the safety plans that you see businesses missing or not being as complete as they need to be under the new expectations? So now a year in, what are you seeing that's constantly being missed?
Well, I can jump in first and then maybe hand it over to Arun at that point. So, I mean, I think for the most part, we've seen that businesses are very focused and successful in creating their plans, which is encouraging. I mean, for the most part, when we go out and visit with employers, they're doing what they need to be doing. So I think to start off with that's an important point. And it is, of course, important that within that safety plan, that it's applied to all aspects of the business. And I think where we're seeing some employers maybe not meeting the mark is where they're not considering things like their lunch rooms or their break rooms or their meeting rooms, or where workers may be congregating outside of the general duties of their tasks. I mean, for the most part, employers are doing a good job of having protocols in place, but that might be an area where they're missing the mark a little bit. You know, we've done some recent inspections in Whistler over the last number of weeks based on the outbreaks, and when we did those inspections, what we found were that there were some issues around posting of the COVID safety plan. So many of the employers had a COVID safety plan, but weren't posting it. We found that some employers weren't keeping it up to date. And that's an important point. And I talked about that 6-step process, and step 5 is around revisions to that model,
Sure.
revisions to your COVID safety plan. It's really important that employers are continuing to work with their workers, their workforce, gathering feedback and keeping that plan up to date as conditions change. So that's an area that we've seen some gaps. We've seen gaps around occupancy limit procedures and policies.
Okay.
So again, considering a lunchroom or a break room, what is the size of that break room? What is going to be your occupancy limit within that? And then actually enforcing that occupancy limit, making sure it's posted, making sure workers are aware of it, and then providing that supervision. We've seen some gaps around the use of PPE,
Okay.
the use of masks in particular, and the use of barriers where physical distancing can't be maintained. Employers do need to consider other control measures in the hierarchy of controls. And so we're seeing some gaps, a few gaps there. And then also procedures around if there's positive cases that come across the workplace, and what employers are doing to ensure that they have the appropriate cleaning and disinfecting protocols in place, that they have policies in place for their employees not to be coming to the workplace if they're showing any signs of symptoms, and so on and so forth. But again, those are some of the areas that are jumping out when we do our inspections. But for the most part, employers are doing a really great job of keeping these plans.
That's really good to hear. That's a really good statement to make at the end of it, because I know they've been working so hard on keeping up to date. So if it's tweaking it a little bit more and making sure they're staying on top of it, that's good to share. Arun, now go2HR, as we talked about, has a safety plan that our businesses can access to for you to support them. Same question is, are you seeing a similar trend in things being missed in safety plans?
Firstly, thank you, Melissa, for having me. And I want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the shared unceded traditional territory of the Katsi, Semiahmoo, Kwantlen, and other Coast Salish peoples. So yes, to kind of reiterate what Chris said, we are seeing, as you mentioned, we are doing the safety plan review initiative that allows businesses to send us their safety plans so that we can take a look at it and give them some feedback. And I'll speak to that more at the end of the session. But as a part of that, we've had a lot of businesses send their plans to us, including several from Whistler. The key thing, as Chris mentioned, is most of them have the major elements in place. One of the things that we sometimes see with employers is, especially when they're using a plan that maybe was supplied to them by an association, or they borrowed it from someone else that they knew, or a larger employer, they tend to use the plan as is and try to adapt it without necessarily taking into account their specific circumstances. So those are times, sometimes you see a gap between what they're doing versus maybe what someone else is doing, which doesn't quite transport exactly the same way. So we encourage employers to look around their workplaces to ensure that they have considered all the areas that potentially pose risks for the transmission of COVID-19.
That makes a lot of sense, yeah.
Yeah. The other piece is around, when you're having employees come back to work. So if someone has been out sick with COVID or has been isolating, so do you have clear procedures about how they need to come back? I mean, is there clarity who comes back, when they come back? So there's often a lack of clarity in specifying that clearly. Also, in the workplace, who is responsible for implementing the plan? And this has come up in a couple of different scenarios, because oftentimes what happens is, if there's some pushback from customers, someone's not following the plan. So, it's often a frontline employee who gets tasked with dealing with it. So what is their comfort level in knowing that someone's there to support them? Is their manager there, their owner there? How far can they go with it? How strictly do they need to enforce it? So we often see that level of support, if that's identified clearly in the plan, and there's a clear accountability in terms of who's implementing that plan, who's responsible for implementing, then the plan gets implemented better.
I think that goes to a question then, which is really to both again, is what is the best way to communicate changes with employees, given the fatigue of ongoing change management and limitations for training sessions? What is the best way? And that maybe that's not a question that we can answer, because there's so many different businesses out there doing different things in communication, but what have you seen?
I can kind of jump in there, and this is again, I completely get it. There's so many changes happening in so many different ways that employers have to deal with, not just related to safety, but also their business and their finance and all that. So what we suggest to employers is to use some of the current mechanisms that they have in place for leveraging those changes. For instance, if you have to change a work procedure, what do you do? Do you bring it up in staff briefings? Do you have emails that go around?
Sure.
What is the mechanism that you use? Kind of replicate that instead of having something new for this.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I agree. I don't know, Chris, if you have anything you wanted to add to that you've seen out there.
Yeah, I think I mean, it's so true. The COVID fatigue, we talk about the COVID fatigue all the time, and even without COVID, change management can be a challenging task for any employer. And so when you've got a safety plan that's being revised on a fairly regular basis as conditions change, that can be fatiguing. Excuse me. But I think the important piece I want to add in here is just the importance of involving the workforce throughout that process and that communication process, and by having the employer demonstrate their commitment to keeping the workers safe, related, I mean, we're talking about COVID,
Sure.
so related to COVID risk within the workplace, and involving the workers in that process, then I think that change can be less abrupt for them.
Right.
So instead of the employer just changing their plan and sending out a communication, and the workers are like, well, where did that come from? I
Right.
think by involving them in that process and ensuring that they have a say, they have an opportunity to provide feedback, and they see potentially some of their feedback being implemented into the plan,
Yeah.
that can go a long ways in helping build that, I'll say, that culture of safety within the organization, that everyone, it doesn't matter who, everyone in the organization is thinking about how they're protecting themselves and protecting others related to the COVID risk. And I think that can make the change less fatiguing, so to speak.
Yeah, and it makes sense because we have a small team. We're a team of 4. And when the safety plans came to fruition last year, we involved the team. We do team huddles every morning. We work remotely, but we have team huddles in the mornings. And that's an example of what we've chosen to do as a team to keep things up to date. So that's really helped. It's that whole buy-in mentality of, if you incorporate thoughts from employees, then most likely they'll more likely to adapt to the changes, for sure. Arun, did you have anything that you wanted to add to that at that point?
No, I think Chris makes an important point here. Involving your frontline staff is probably really critical, especially in places where you have a lot of frontline staff. So it's important that everyone recognizes that their opinions are being considered, and there's definitely greater commitment. So you don't really want compliance, you want commitment. I mean, you want people to think that they are part of this and they're doing something to pull together towards an objective. So underlying that is exactly what Chris mentioned. So that's critical.
That makes a lot of sense. Chris, there seems to be a misunderstanding that colleagues can form a work bubble. And what is the guidance around ways to safely socialize in the workplace? So this is a big thing here. I mean, we have people living together, we have close proximity working in coffee shops or restaurants or such. What does that look like, really?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, Melissa. I have to say that I think that's a false impression. It really is a false impression that workers in the workplace are forming a bubble because of the exposures that happen outside of the workplace, and exposures by the different people that they interact with outside of the workplace. And so really, we're sort of going into this with the philosophy that there are no bubbles within the workplace. The employer really needs to focus on their COVID safety plan in all aspects of the job. And earlier I talked about that applies to the break rooms and the lunch rooms and the areas of the business that may be outside of the regular day-to-day activities of the workers. Mm-hmm. We even encourage employers to communicate with their workforce around carpooling. And even though that may be outside and really is outside of the control or the responsibility of the employer, communicating that with workers, that if you've got a group of workers that are picking each other up on the way into work, and their commute into work, they should be doing their own safety check and symptom check before they're all getting into that vehicle. And they should be ensuring that they're wearing their masks and have almost their own mini COVID safety plan just for that carpool and that commute into the workplace. So we would like employers and workers to consider that the workplace is not a place where a bubble can be formed. They still need to maintain their physical distancing. They need to wear their masks. They need to have barriers in place where physical distancing can't be maintained. Cleaning and disinfecting protocols need to be maintained, and that goes for all aspects of the workplace. And I think that conversation, again, I go back to the importance of the communication between the employer and the workers. I think that conversation with the workers, for them to understand that from the employer's perspective, they are going to be developing that plan, enforcing that plan, supervising based on the fact that that in all aspects of the business that plan needs to be adhered to, with the assumption that there are no bubbles, so to speak, in place within the workplace.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's hard because many people won't consider that as a safety plan for themselves, to have a safety plan before they even get to work. So perhaps even that whole concept of an employer communicating that to their employees that are making those trips with others to come into work, or discouraging them from doing that and finding different ways to get there. But yeah, it's tough. It's not an easy time, no doubt. So again, both of you can certainly feel free to help us understand the next couple of questions. So some common mistakes we've talked about in the safety plan. So we haven't talked about working from home. So staff working from home. What sort of guidance can you give our community around common mistakes, and certainly some suggestions on how not to make those common mistakes? Arun, do you have anything that has popped up for you?
So working from home, I guess, the risk profile kind of changes, right? So there's really no, there's not a workplace, so you're not interacting with other people that you work with. So some of the challenges that we are seeing from working from home are related to slightly, different elements of health and safety, in terms of working, mental health related issues, people who are by themselves and working alone, ergonomics related issues, which which are often overlooked. So people don't necessarily have a perfect setup.
Sure.
I know a colleague of mine who works from her, a kitchen table. So that's not the perfectly ergonomic, setting for work. So
I don't know
those things.
that.
Yeah. So we're coming up on a year of doing this, and it's beginning to show, right? I mean, it's beginning to show the effects of doing this from an environment that's not perfectly suitable for some of this, and the other challenges with just having other things going on at the same time and trying to balance all those priorities. And I think we can see the mental health impacts clearly build up. I mean, you can see that it kind of ebbs and flows with almost the seasonality and Dr. Bonnie Henry's announcements, and you can kind of track that. But it's important that we're telling employers to ensure that they recognize that this is a challenge that their employees are facing, whether you're in the office or in the workplace, or whether they're working remotely, to understand that employees are dealing with significant issues, and so are employers. I mean, in all fairness, especially small businesses, I mean, they're struggling. They don't know then what's going to happen next, especially in tourism and hospitality. So all around, there is such a huge impact on mental health, which needs to be recognized, and more than anything else, you need to speak about it. So for that not to be taboo, or not to be a topic that's not easily spoken about, to kind of make that clear from an employer's perspective or a manager's perspective, that that's an acceptable conversation to have in the workplace. So I think those are things that are critical, especially when you're working remotely.
Something simple that we do at the Chamber, I like to use what we do, and not to say that we're perfect, but we certainly strive to model what we should all be doing. And one of the things we do in our team huddles is we start with understanding basically a number from 1 to 10, 10 being ecstatic, excited, what your level of energy is out. Because really, when you're working remotely, you don't know what somebody's work day is like. You don't know how their energy is going into it. And sometimes it's a number and then a word attached to it. So as a CEO of the Chamber, for instance, I will then, if I need to and I feel like it, I might call my that person for work, my colleague, and say, hey, what's up? What kind of support do you need? It just helps to understand where people are at. It could be just overload of work. It could be excitement. So that's good. But I think it's really important to stay in touch with that. So I agree with you on that. And then Chris, we've talked about the the employees and the work setting inside. We haven't touched too much on low contact customer service business settings and then the higher contact customer service settings, and what are some of the common mistakes being made there. So you can go into a coffee shop and there's a big plexiglass, people are wearing masks, and what I always see is people take their mask off and go around the side of the the plexiglass, which really defeats the purpose. But what are you seeing? What are you seeing out there that we can learn from?
Yeah, I mean, it sort of goes back to what we were talking about right at the beginning, that I think for the most part, employers are doing the best that they can, and are doing a good job of having that COVID safety plan in place. We have, though, seen that some employers are focusing more so on that COVID safety plan with their workers, as opposed to what is that customer service interaction. You know, if you're in an office setting and you don't see a lot of customers during the day, or a lot of anyone outside of your own workforce during the day, then that COVID safety plan is much more contained than if you are in a coffee shop or in another setting where you've got the general public coming in throughout the day. So a couple things there, and it's tricky for an employer because they do need to be protecting their workforce, which means their COVID safety plan needs to consider the policies and procedures that are going to apply to anyone coming into the work site. So that health check type approach of ensuring that that the general public that's coming into the work site doesn't have any signs and symptoms of COVID, that they haven't been told to self-isolate by public health, and that they haven't traveled outside of the country within the last 14 days. Like, those three simple questions should be asked of folks coming in. And that can be an active ask, or that can be through signage and other means. And then you get into sort of that, I'll say, the supervision, or I guess you could use the word enforcement in a way, of the protocols inside the establishment. So if you have a policy in place, which is really a provincial health order at this point in time, where people need to be wearing masks when they are inside, then you do need to have a level of communication to those who may not be complying, and have a process and procedure in place for those situations. Now, the tricky part is where that can potentially then lead to aggressive behavior or violent type situations. And so if you are working in a setting that has exposure to the general public, as an employer, you'd also need to make sure that you have a violence prevention plan in place, a violence prevention program in place, and that you've given your staff the appropriate training and education on what protocols and policies are going to be enacted if a situation like that does arise. And in the restaurant industry, in the accommodation industry, you know, a lot of what you see up in Whistler, you know, you do need to, those types of businesses that you see up in Whistler, those employers should be giving consideration to the violence prevention program that they have in place with their workers in case those situations do arise. A really, really important aspect that may be kind of missed in the development of a COVID safety plan.
That's a really, you know, I never considered that as far as additional training or awareness. I know it happens, but it's not just a customer saying something negative, it's actually acting out in a very negative, volatile situation. So I'm going to give some thought to that in terms of what perhaps the Chamber could do to support the business community further in understanding what that is, and find some tools and resources to help small business and businesses to. So thank you. That's a great suggestion. Arun, do you have any comments to make on that?
Yes, in fact, that's a very key thing, and it's coming up in many different environments. We've done a webinar on that. I can share that link.
That would be great. Thank you.
But we also developed some script around it, common script that employers can use or employees can use in frontline positions when they're confronted by specific situations. So just a little bit of verbiage, a little bit of language that they can use when customers start getting a little difficult.
Yeah, I have to say, Arun, we saw that resource. We're very impressed by what your organization has put together for employers in tourism and hospitality to be able to hopefully deal with those types of situations. So kudos to you for that resource that you developed.
Mm-hmm.
Melissa, I also just actually wanted to come back for a moment to something Arun was talking about related to working at home. So great points, absolutely. But also just wanted to ensure that employers realize or recognize that they still have a responsibility for health and safety for their workers who may be working in a home environment. So it may not be the traditional work setting, but they are still doing work on behalf of that employer while they are in their work setting. So it does become their workplace, and the employer has a responsibility to ensure the health and safety of the workers within that setting. Now, that does not mean that an employer is going to go out and do an inspection of your home, because there's obviously privacy issues there. But we have some resources on our website that can help employers and employees go through a bit of a checklist type format to be able to do an inspection of their work site, consider the ergonomic setup of their workstation, have check-in procedures in place, talk about emergency preparedness, and then have that conversation over the phone. So it is difficult, it's more challenging, but very important for employers to understand that their responsibility for health and safety still exists if their workers are in the home environment.
A great point. Great. Thank you for that. Absolutely. And so, Arun, I wanted to bring it back to you around talking about the COVID-19 safety plan review. I know back in December, our chamber had supported you in the pilot program, which obviously was successful. So you've grown it to have this accessible to all British Columbian businesses. So can you explain what this program is? We've kind of touched on it through this conversation, but how it can help businesses build a successful plan, and how a business can access this support, which of course we'll share the links and the phone numbers, but if you could give us an overview, that would be great.
Sure. I think we decided on doing this because we were getting calls from businesses, related to the plan, and the questions were often very similar. And people had WorkSafeBC has an excellent template there, but sometimes businesses had specific questions about their workplace. So we figured that there's probably an opportunity to help support, especially the smaller or mid-sized businesses that don't have too much internal capacity, to be able to look at some of their plans that they put in place and offer some feedback so that they can better adapt it to their work environment. So it's just a basic review based on a checklist that we've created, which is in turn based on the template that WorkSafeBC has put out to just go through that. So when a business registers for this, one of our safety specialists reaches out to them and gets a little bit of information on what exactly they do and what their environment is and the context is, and then ask them to send whatever safety plan that they have for a review. So then through that evaluation, I wouldn't call it evaluation, through that review process, they use a checklist and then give them some specific feedback related to items in that plan, which they could either work on where there's any kind of inadequacy spotted, or if there's something that they could do to augment or implement that plan a little better. So that's pretty much all there is to it. And this is something that as you said, we're doing this across BC now for all tourism and hospitality businesses. So we encourage employers to reach out and take advantage of this.
It's a huge support. I know that working with especially small business, where they're in the shops working now and they're dealing with the COVID and they're dealing with trying to get grants and all that, it's really hard to get it right all the time. So having that support for something so crucial to keeping businesses open is exceptional. So thank you for that. Is there a cost?
No, there isn't.
Okay.
Not.
That's fantastic. And then in closing, Chris, I wanted to give you sort of last comments or anything that we haven't covered that you wanted to touch on. We've talked about quite a bit. So.
Yeah, no, we did. Thanks, Melissa. And I think, maybe a couple just key points to finish off on. Again, I want to bring employers back to the concept of the COVID safety plan and the fact that process, that 5-step, 6-step process that you can go through for a COVID safety plan, that holds true, and it will hold true. Really, you could remove the word COVID and replace it with any other health and safety risk, and that process works. It's about assessing the risk. It's about putting control measures in place. And it's about communication, supervision, training, and then that continuous improvement process of continuously looking at the plan and keeping it up to date. And I think as we see things evolve here, we've got changes happening with provincial health orders. So employers may need to modify their plan as those provincial health orders are changing. We have weather conditions changing.
Yes.
You know, we see as we got into the winter weather here, there was less of an opportunity for some employers to have their workers outside. Or if they did have to have their workers outside, how is their plan going to change as a result of that? So it's really about continuously reviewing that plan, keeping it up to date, involving your workforce, and ensuring that as the employer, you are not, I'll say, taking your eye off the ball related to COVID. This is a risk that is not going away anytime soon. Even after we're all, you know, hopefully when we've all had an opportunity to be vaccinated at some point in the future, COVID will still be around. And so we do need to consider this as a risk, as we do with any other risks that are in the workplace. It'll become more commonplace for us as we move forward. But it's important that employers start to embed this within their day-to-day operations and really take that framework and apply it to health and safety in general.
That's great. Well, that's good feedback. Great closing statement. I want to thank both of you for joining us this morning in this conversation. And of course, thank you to the members who submitted some questions in advance to ask you today. For those that are watching this video, if there are any further questions or concerns that you may have, please reach out to the Chamber team. We are here to help. We will continue to stay connected with all of you through regular e-news updates, and we'll be hosting more webinars and updates to help navigate these challenging times. Your Chamber does have an advocacy and action member input session coming up on February the 18th. This virtual meeting is open to all members at no cost. You can sign up online at whistlerchamber.com. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Arun, for making the virtual trip to Whistler, for taking the time to update our community. We really appreciate your continued support in this ongoing effort of keeping our community safe. So thank you.
Thanks, Melissa.
Thanks, Melissa.